It all started on an ordinary Tuesday, or at least it was supposed to be. I clocked into work at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., like I did every morning. The building, an old sprawling labyrinth of cold marble and dim corridors, always had a way of making you feel small. It was the kind of place where history weighed heavy in the air, though most days it just smelled like mildew and stale coffee. My name's Arthur Miller, just an average guy, really. I'm an archivist, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my days sorting through old files that no one else cares about. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Plus, there's a certain peace in being surrounded by the whispers of the past, even if it means spending hours in a basement with flickering lights. That day, I got assigned to a section no one wanted to touch, Sub-Basement 3. The name alone made people shudder. It was where all the forgotten, misfiled, or too sensitive to be handled documents were stored. Some of it was junk, random memos, old payrolls, but every now and then you'd stumble on something interesting like declassified CIA reports or cryptic military logs. So there I was, alone, sorting through boxes that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me was the only sound, a low, irritating buzz that made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. The room itself was massive, with rows upon rows of towering shelves, each packed with dusty, sagging cardboard boxes. A real paradise for someone who liked being unnoticed, which, lucky for me, I did. About an hour into the shift, I found it. It was tucked away in the corner of a box labeled Miscellaneous 1987. The folder was thicker than most, its edges yellowed and curling. But what caught my eye was the bright red stamp on the front. Classified, do not open. I froze. Now, I've been trained to ignore things like that. It's protocol, after all. If it's stamped classified, you're supposed to send it up the chain. But something about that folder, I couldn't explain it. It was like it was calling to me, daring me to take a peek. I hesitated, glancing around the empty room. No cameras, no supervisors, just me, a dimly lit corner, and a folder that shouldn't exist. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly. I told myself it was curiosity, but deep down, I knew it was something more, something darker. I cracked it open, just enough to glimpse the first page. That was all it took. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe some dry government report or heavily redacted memos, but what I found was worse, much worse. The pages were filled with detailed descriptions of deaths. Not accidents or natural causes, but violent, gruesome deaths. Each entry had a name, a date, and a chillingly precise account of how it happened. The names felt strangely familiar, and when I glanced at the dates, my stomach churned. They all lined up perfectly with recent news stories, murders, freak accidents, even that bizarre gas explosion downtown last week. I slammed the folder shut, my hands shaking. No way, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding hollow in the vast, empty space. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, right? But the more I thought about it, the more a cold knot of fear twisted in my gut. The details were too exact, too specific to be fake. I wanted to put it back, to pretend I'd never seen it, but my hands wouldn't let go of the folder. It was like I was tethered to it now, bound by some invisible force. With a shaky breath, I flipped it open again, this time turning to the last page. And that's when I saw it. My name, Arthur Miller. The date was 3 weeks from now. For a moment, I just stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. There was a description too, of course, painfully detailed, right down to the color of my shirt and the time of day. My blood turned to ice as I read it, the words blurring together in my panic. It wasn't just a death, it was my death. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I closed the folder, gripping it tightly like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. My head spun as questions swirled in my mind. How could this be possible? Why was my name in there? And most importantly, what the hell was I supposed to do now? I stumbled out of the room, clutching the folder to my chest like it might disappear if I let it out of my sight. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, each step amplifying the dread bubbling inside me. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this building, this folder, this nightmare as I could. But I knew deep down that there was no running from this. Whatever was happening, it had already started. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my name scrawled on that page, staring back at me like a death sentence. Arthur Miller, 3 weeks. It didn't matter how much I tried to convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a clerical error. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. The details were too sharp, too specific. Someone, somewhere, knew something I didn't. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the National Archives, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I stared up at the building, its imposing facade of stone and glass glaring down at me like it was daring me to step inside. I almost didn't. A part of me wanted to throw the folder into the nearest trash can and pretend this whole thing never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it would find its way back to me, like it had a mind of its own. Inside, the atmosphere felt off. The usual hum of voices and shuffling papers was quieter than normal, like the building itself was holding its breath. I avoided the elevator and took the stairs down to the sub-basement. Each step echoed in the stairwell, amplifying the growing knot in my stomach. When I reached sub-basement 3, the air felt colder, heavier somehow. The rows of shelves loomed over me, their shadows stretching across the floor like skeletal fingers. I walked straight to where I'd found the folder the day before, hoping, praying, that it would still be there. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. Maybe I'd grabbed the wrong file. Maybe. The box was empty. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the shelves for any sign of it. Nothing. It was gone. No, not gone. It was waiting for me, back at my desk, right where I'd left it. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the folder that shouldn't have been there. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the faint hum of the overhead lights. With trembling hands, I picked it up and flipped it open. The pages were the same, but something was different. A new name had been added to the list. Rachel Carter. Date, tomorrow. Rachel Carter. I knew that name. She worked 2 floors up in public records. I'd only spoken to her a handful of times. She always smiled when she passed my desk, her arms full of files. I didn't know her well, but the thought of her name being in this folder made my stomach churn. I had to warn her. But how? How do you explain something like this without sounding insane? Hey Rachel, just a heads up. There's a government file predicting your death tomorrow. Thought you should know. Yeah, that would go over well. Still, I couldn't do nothing. Around lunchtime, I took the elevator up to her floor. The doors slid open to reveal the usual buzz of office life. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, people milling about with coffee mugs in hand. I spotted Rachel near the back, sorting through a stack of files. Hey Rachel, I said, trying to sound casual. My voice cracked a little and she glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Arthur, right? From Archives?
Yeah, that's me.
I cleared my throat.
Listen, can I talk to you for a second? Privately?
Her brow furrowed, but she nodded, motioning for me to follow her to a quieter corner near the break room. What's up? She asked, folding her arms. I hesitated, my mind racing. How much could I say without sounding like a lunatic? I found something in the files yesterday, something with your name on it. Her expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and unease. My name? What kind of file? It's hard to explain, I said, fumbling for words. But it mentioned tomorrow's date. I think you might be in danger. Rachel stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. Is this some kind of joke? No, I said quickly. I swear it's not. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but you need to be careful. Stay home tomorrow. Avoid crowded places. Just don't take any chances. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. Right. Well, thanks for the warning, I guess. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling like an idiot. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her name in that folder. That night I stayed late, combing through the archives for anything that might explain what was happening. I found nothing. As I packed up to leave, I heard it. Soft footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. I froze, listening. Hello? I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures, shrouded in dark cloaks, standing at the end of the hall. Their faces were hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I blinked, they were gone. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. The thought of being alone in my apartment, with the memory of those hooded figures burned into my mind, was unbearable. Instead, I stayed in the archives, pacing between rows of shelves, trying to make sense of everything. My thoughts kept circling back to Rachel Carter. Tomorrow. Her name. Her date. Could I stop it? By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this happen. If the folder was predicting deaths, maybe I could intervene, break whatever twisted cycle this was. I didn't care if Rachel thought I was crazy. I had to try. As soon as the office opened, I headed straight to her floor. She was already at her desk, sipping coffee and scrolling through emails. The normalcy of it all made my stomach twist. She had no idea.
Rachel?
I said, breathless from the stairs. She looked up, startled. Listen, I know you think I'm insane, but I need you to trust me. Her eyes narrowed. Arthur, what are you... No time, I cut her off. You can't be here today. You have to leave right now. She frowned, glancing around the room like she was looking for help. Look, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not going to just... Rachel, please! My voice cracked louder than I intended. Heads turned and I lowered my voice, leaning in. I can't explain everything, but if you stay here, something bad is going to happen. Her expression softened, just a little. Arthur, are you okay? You look like you haven't slept. I'm fine, I'll be fine, but you won't be if you stay. My hands were trembling. Please, just trust me. Before she could answer, the fire alarm blared, cutting through the office with its shrill, piercing wail. People jumped up from their desks, confusion spreading like wildfire. Rachel froze, her coffee cup slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. What the hell? She muttered. I grabbed her arm. We need to go now. The crowd moved toward the exits, a slow, chaotic shuffle of bodies. I kept a firm grip on Rachel, pulling her through the swarm. My heart pounded, every nerve in my body screaming that something was wrong. The alarm wasn't a drill. I could feel it in my bones. We made it to the stairwell, the concrete walls amplifying the noise of hurried footsteps and muffled voices. As we descended, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes in the shadows. My breath hitched. They were here, the hooded figures. I tightened my grip on Rachel's arm, practically dragging her down the stairs. Faster, I whispered. We have to move faster. She glanced back, her face pale. Arthur, what? Just keep going, I said, cutting her off. When we burst out onto the street, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face. People were gathered in clusters, murmuring and glancing up at the building. The alarm still blared, but there was no sign of fire, no smoke, nothing. And then I saw them. Across the street, two hooded figures stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly, as if watching us. My chest tightened. They didn't move, but their presence was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Arthur, Rachel said, her voice trembling. Who are they? I don't know, I admitted. But they're not here to help. Before she could respond, a deafening boom shattered the air. The ground shook beneath us as glass rained down from the upper floors of the building. People screamed, scattering in all directions. I turned just in time to see a massive chunk of debris crash onto the spot where Rachel's desk had been. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God! It's not over, I said, pulling her away from the chaos. We have to get out of here. We ran, weaving through the panicked crowd until we reached an alley a few blocks away. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I didn't stop until I was sure we weren't being followed. Rachel leaned against the wall, her face pale and streaked with sweat. Arthur, what the hell is going on? Who are those people? And how did you know this was going to happen? I hesitated, the weight of the folder in my bag feeling heavier than ever. It's complicated, I said finally. But those hooded people, they're connected to something big, something dangerous. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharp and searching. You're going to tell me everything. No more cryptic warnings, no more half answers. Before I could respond, the alley grew darker, as if the sun had disappeared. I turned, and my heart stopped. They were there, all of them, 5 hooded figures, standing at the entrance, blocking our escape. Run, I whispered, but I knew it was too late. Rachel froze, her eyes wide as the hooded figures advanced. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like predators closing in on cornered prey. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I stepped in front of her instinctively, my hands trembling as I tried to think of a way out. Arthur, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. What do they want? Me, I said, the realization hitting me like a freight train. They've been after me from the start. The figure in the middle tilted its head as if acknowledging the truth. My mind raced, trying to piece together what little I understood. The folder, the deaths, my name, it all led back to them. They weren't just observers, they were orchestrators. Stay behind me, I told Rachel, my voice steadier than I felt. I didn't know what I could possibly do against them, but I wasn't going to let her get hurt. The lead figure raised a hand, and the air around us seemed to shift. The alley grew colder, the shadows deeper. A low, unnatural hum filled the space, vibrating in my chest like a warning. They weren't human, at least not anymore. Arthur Miller, the figure said, its voice a chilling blend of male and female tones. You cannot escape your role. My role? I shot back, my voice cracking. What the hell are you talking about? You know, it replied as if the words themselves were a command. You wrote the files. You set the events into motion. And now the cycle must complete. The memory hit me like a bolt of lightning. Flashes of a sterile room, my hands scribbling furiously on paper, the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I had written the files. I had been part of their twisted experiment, but I didn't remember why. You erased my memory, I said, the pieces falling into place. You turned me into your pawn. To protect the system, the figure said. You were too unpredictable, too dangerous, but you cannot outrun fate. You must fulfill your purpose.
Arthur,
Rachel said, grabbing my arm.
what are they talking about? What did you do?
I shook my head, my throat tight. I didn't have a choice, I whispered. They made me do it. The figure stepped closer, and I instinctively stepped back, pressing Rachel against the wall. Your time has come, it said. The balance depends on it.
No, I said, my voice rising. Not this time.
I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. The pages felt heavier now, like they were alive, pulsing with energy. I flipped to the last page, my own name staring back at me, mocking me. 3 weeks from now? No. Today. This moment. You want me to play my role? I said, my voice trembling with anger. Fine. Let's end this. The figures paused, as if waiting for my next move. I pulled a pen from my pocket and gripped it tightly, the cold metal biting into my skin. My hands shook as I hovered over the page, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me.
Arthur, don't,
Rachel said, her voice breaking.
There has to be another way.
There isn't, I said, meeting her eyes. This ends with me. With a deep breath, I crossed out my name. The ink bled into the page, spreading like black veins across the paper. The folder trembled in my hands, the air around us growing heavier, thicker. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV. You cannot rewrite what has been set, the lead figure hissed, its voice breaking into 100 echoes. Watch me, I said, flipping the pen around. I scrawled new words on the page, my mind focused on one thing: freedom. For Rachel, for everyone else. I wrote their names, each of the hooded figures, and their end. The reaction was immediate. The alley lit up with a blinding flash, the figures letting out inhuman screams as their forms began to dissolve. The hum in the air grew deafening, the ground trembling beneath us. Rachel clung to me, her grip tight as the world seemed to unravel around us. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, the alley was empty. The figures were gone. The folder lay on the ground, its pages blank. My legs gave out and I collapsed to my knees, the adrenaline draining from my body. Arthur, Rachel said, kneeling beside me. What just happened? I shook my head, too exhausted to explain. It's over, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I think it's finally over. She helped me to my feet and we staggered out of the alley together. The city buzzed around us as if nothing had happened, the world continuing on as it always did. But I knew better. Something had changed. I turned to Rachel, my voice steadier now. Thank you for trusting me. She gave me a weak smile. I still don't understand any of this, but you saved my life. That's enough for now. As we walked away, I glanced back one last time. The folder was gone, but the shadows of the alley lingered, a quiet reminder of the truth I'd uncovered. And deep down, I knew the cycle wasn't really broken. Not completely. It all started on a rainy Tuesday in Boston. I had just walked out of yet another failed audition, clutching my violin case like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the world. The city felt unusually gray that day, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder why you even try. I had been chasing this dream of becoming a professional musician for as long as I could remember, but lately, it felt more like the dream was chasing me, and I was losing. To clear my head, I wandered through the narrow streets near Beacon Hill, letting my feet take me wherever they wanted. That's when I saw it, a tiny, cluttered shop wedged between two towering brick buildings. The sign above the door read, McCarthy's Antiques and Curiosities. Something about it felt magnetic, like it had been waiting for me to find it. Without really thinking, I pushed the creaky wooden door open and stepped inside. The smell of aged wood and dust hit me immediately, along with the faint scent of something sweet. Lavender, maybe? The shop was packed floor to ceiling with all sorts of oddities. Old typewriters, faded books, cracked porcelain dolls with eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. It was the kind of place where every object seemed to carry a story if you were willing to listen. Looking for something specific, came a voice from behind the counter. I turned to see an elderly man with thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His voice was raspy, like he'd spent a lifetime smoking cigars or yelling over the roar of some bygone crowd. "Not really," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just browsing." That's when I saw it. In a stack of faded sheet music on a table near the window, something caught my eye. A single piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges slightly curled. The title at the top read, "Elise's Song." The handwritten notes on the staff were intricate, almost impossibly so, as if the composer had poured their soul into every single one. I picked it up, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. There was something about it, something that felt alive. "You sure you want that one?" the old man asked, his tone suddenly quieter. "Why wouldn't I replied, frowning. He hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "That piece, it has a history. People who've owned it before, well, let's just say they didn't have the best luck." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the chill that crept up my spine. "It's just music," I said, more to myself than to him. How bad could it be? The man didn't argue. Instead, he shrugged and rang me up. $5, he said. As he handed me the receipt, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Be careful with it, though." That night, I couldn't get the sheet music out of my mind. It sat on the coffee table in my tiny apartment, practically daring me to pick up my violin and play it. So I did. The first notes were haunting, the kind of melody that wraps itself around you and refuses to let go. As I played, something strange happened, something I still can't fully explain. I heard a voice, a soft, almost whisper-like soprano, humming along with the tune. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe someone walking down the street. But when I stopped playing, the voice stopped too. The room was silent. I tried again, my bow gliding across the strings with a mix of hesitation and curiosity. The voice returned, stronger this time, like it was standing right behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but of course, no one was there. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're losing it, Sophia," I muttered to myself, setting the violin down. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Somewhere, faintly, I swore I could still hear the melody. And that's when the dream started. In the first one, I was standing in an old concert hall, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. The air smelled of wood polish and candle wax. On the stage stood a woman in a long flowing dress, her back turned to me. She was singing the same melody from the sheet music, her voice so beautiful it hurt. When she turned to face me, I woke up, sweating, heart pounding. I reached for the sheet music on my bedside table. The notes looked different somehow, clearer, bolder, as if they'd been freshly written. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The next morning, the dream was still lingering in my head. That woman, her voice, her presence, it felt so real, too real. I tried to shake it off as I got ready for the day, but something about her eyes, dark, piercing, almost knowing, kept haunting me. I couldn't leave it alone. After my morning shift at the coffee shop, I went straight to the library. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but I started searching for anything that could tell me more about Elise's song. Hours passed as I flipped through dusty music anthologies and old archives on the library's creaky computers. Finally, I found something. A small mention in an obscure music journal from the late 1800s. Elise McKinley. She had been a composer, one of the first women to gain recognition in a world dominated by men. The article called her a brilliant mind silenced too soon, and said she'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances before finishing her last composition. Her final piece, it said, was never completed, though fragments of it had been rumored to resurface over the years. Fragments, like the sheet music sitting in my apartment. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a pull, a connection to Elise, like her story wasn't just something I'd stumbled upon, but something meant for me to find. When I got home that evening, the sheet music was exactly where I'd left it on the coffee table. For a moment, I hesitated, my fingers hovering over it. Then, almost like I was in a trance, I picked up my violin and began to play. The melody poured out of me effortlessly, like I'd been playing it my entire life. As the notes filled the room, the voice returned, clearer, stronger, almost harmonizing with me. I kept playing, my movements faster, more urgent, until I felt a cold breeze sweep through the apartment. I froze, lowering my violin. The room was still, but I wasn't alone. She was there. The woman from my dream stood in the corner of the room, her pale figure shimmering like light on water. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her dress, long and flowing, seemed to move even though there was no wind.
Who are you?
I whispered, my voice trembling.
Elise,
She said simply. Her voice was as beautiful and haunting as the melody itself. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my violin. "This isn't real," I muttered, shaking my head. "You're not real." "I'm as real as the music," she said, stepping closer. "You played my song. You brought me back." Her words sent chills down my spine. "Brought you back? Back from where?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who can finish what I started." "What do you mean, finish?" I asked, my voice shaking. Elise smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was sharp, almost hungry. "The music," she said. "It's incomplete. Together we can make it whole. And when we do, the world will finally hear my masterpiece." I wanted to say no, to throw the sheet music away and pretend none of this had ever happened. But something in her voice and the way she looked at me made it impossible to resist. The days that followed blurred together. Every free moment I had, I spent with the sheet music, composing feverishly. It was like the music was flowing through me, not from me. I couldn't stop, even when my fingers ached or my eyes burned from lack of sleep. Weird things started happening too. Objects in my apartment would move on their own. The mirror in my bathroom would fog up even when the water wasn't running, and I'd see words scrawled across it. "Faster, don't stop, almost there." One night, I came home to find the apartment freezing cold, even though it was the middle of summer. When I turned on the lights, every single one of my picture frames had been knocked over. The glass cracked. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some kind of delayed stress, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I started pulling away from people. My friends texted, asking if I was okay, why I wasn't coming to our usual Friday night hangouts. My mom called, her voice tight with worry, asking why I hadn't visited in weeks. I lied to everyone, saying I was just busy, that I had a new project I was working on. And that wasn't entirely a lie. The music consumed me. It was all I could think about, all I wanted to do. But Elise wasn't just in my apartment anymore. I started seeing her everywhere, in the reflections of storefront windows, in the shadows of empty hallways, in the faces of strangers who looked just a little too familiar. One night, as I played the violin in my living room, she appeared again, closer this time. "You're doing well?" she said, her voice soft but commanding. "It's almost finished." I stopped playing, gripping the neck of my violin so tightly my knuckles turned white. "What happens when it's finished?" Her smile returned, that same sharp, unsettling curve. "You'll see," she said, and then she was gone. I wanted to stop, I wanted to run, but the music wouldn't let me, and neither would Elise. The breaking point came one night when I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming anymore. The music had taken over every corner of my life. My apartment felt smaller, darker, like the walls were closing in. Even the air felt heavy, saturated with the melody that haunted me day and night. I had barely slept in days, my hands trembling every time I picked up the violin, but Elise wouldn't let me stop. Every time I thought about putting it down for good, she would appear, her figure sharper, more solid than before. That night I sat on the floor, the sheet music spread out in front of me. The final notes were forming in my mind, almost against my will. My hands moved on their own, scribbling on the page as if Elise herself was guiding me. The room was silent except for the sound of my pencil scratching against the paper. When I finished the last measure, the room plunged into an unnatural stillness. No cars passing outside, no hum of the refrigerator, just silence so thick it made my ears ring. Then slowly the temperature dropped, and I saw my breath puff out in the air. "Elise," I whispered, though I already knew she was there. She appeared across the room, more real than ever. Her dress shimmered, her dark hair flowing like smoke. But there was something different now. Her beauty felt sharper, more menacing, like a knife that had been unsheathed. "It's done," I said, my voice cracking. "I finished it." She stepped closer, her feet not quite touching the ground. "Not yet," she said, her voice calm but cold. "You need to play it, all of it. Only then will it truly be complete." My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to burn the sheet music and never look back. But I couldn't move. Her gaze held me in place, and I knew there was no escaping her now. I picked up my violin with shaking hands. The bow trembled against the strings as I drew the first note. The melody poured out, but it wasn't just music anymore. It was alive, twisting and writhing in the air like a living thing. As I played, the room seemed to dissolve around me. The walls faded, replaced by darkness that stretched infinitely in every direction. Elise stood at the center of it, her form glowing with an eerie light. "You're doing well," she said. her voice echoing like it was coming from everywhere at once. The music grew louder, more intense, the notes pulling at something deep inside me. My hands moved faster, the bow sliding across the strings as if possessed. My vision blurred, but I kept playing. I couldn't stop. Then the melody reached its climax, and I saw her for what she truly was. Elise wasn't just a ghost or a lost soul. Her face twisted into something monstrous, her eyes burning with a hunger that froze me to the core. The shimmering dress melted into black smoke, and her voice, once beautiful, now sounded like nails scraping against metal.
You've done well, she hissed, her voice no longer sweet. And now, your part is over.
I dropped the violin, but the music didn't stop. It played on, louder and louder, filling the endless void around me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the sound tore through me.
Elise, please, I screamed. You said this would end.
She laughed, a sound so cruel it made my chest ache.
You were never meant to finish the song, she said. You were meant to finish me.
The truth hit me like a blow. The song wasn't just music. It was a vessel, a trap designed to capture souls and feed her insatiable hunger. And now, it had me. My body felt like it was being pulled apart, piece by piece. My vision dimmed as she stepped closer, her form towering over me like a shadow that swallowed all light.
Thank you,
she said, her voice almost gentle again. You've given me everything I need. With a final piercing scream, the darkness consumed me. When I woke up, I was standing in the middle of an empty street. The city around me looked the same, but something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier, like the world had shifted slightly off balance. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, almost translucent, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't alive. Not really. I stumbled back to my apartment, or what used to be my apartment. The door was locked, and through the window, I saw someone else living there. A girl, no older than me, sitting on the couch with the sheet music in her hands. And Elise. She stood behind the girl, her form now entirely human. Her face was radiant, her voice laughing softly as she whispered in the girl's ear. I tried to scream, to warn her, but no sound came out. My reflection in the window stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed. I was nothing now, just another soul trapped in the endless melody of Elise's song. When I realized what I'd become, the horror of it left me paralyzed. I was nothing more than a shadow, a faint echo of the person I used to be. No one could see me, no one could hear me, and Elise was still out there, alive. She had stolen everything from me, and now she was moving on to her next victim. The girl in my old apartment looked so much like I had on that first night. Eager, curious, completely unaware of what she'd just invited into her life. I watched Elise guide her hands to the violin, her voice soft and encouraging, the way she'd been with me. You'll be great, Elise cooed. Just follow the music. I wanted to scream, to break through the glass and stop her, but it was like trying to push against a wall of air. My hands passed through the window as if I wasn't even there. For days, if time even worked the same way anymore, I lingered near the girl, desperate to find a way to warn her. I tried everything I could think of, knocking over objects, whispering her name, even writing on the fogged-up bathroom mirror. But nothing worked. Elise was always there, watching me with a faint smirk as if daring me to stop her. Then, something unexpected happened. One night, as the girl practiced the melody, I felt a pull, a familiar pull, like the music itself was calling me. It was faint, but it was enough to give me hope. I moved closer, letting the notes wrap around me. With every measure, I felt stronger, more real. And then it hit me. The music had bound me to Elise, but maybe it could also unbind me. It was a risk, but it was the only chance I had. The next time Elise left the girl alone, I focused everything I had on the sheet music. I couldn't touch it, but I could feel the energy radiating from it, like it was alive. The melody played in my mind, every note etched into my memory. I started to hum. It was quiet at first, a trembling, uncertain sound. But as I sang, the melody grew stronger, reverberating through the room. The air around the sheet music began to shift, like ripples in water. Elise appeared instantly, her form flickering with rage.
What are you doing?
She hissed, her voice sharp and cutting. I didn't stop, I couldn't. The girl looked up, startled. Who's there? She whispered, clutching her violin. For the first time, she seemed to sense me, her eyes scanning the room. Elise lunged at me, her hands clawing through the air, but she couldn't touch me, not anymore. The music was protecting me now, breaking the chains she had wrapped around my soul.
Stop!
Elise screamed, her voice cracking.
You don't know what you're doing!
But I did. The melody shifted, bending to my will as I poured everything I had into it. I wasn't just singing, I was fighting back. For myself, for every person Elise had taken. The sheet music began to burn, the notes glowing red hot before disintegrating into ash. Elise let out a scream that shook the walls, her form dissolving like smoke in the wind. And then just like that, she was gone. The girl dropped her violin, staring at the now empty spot where Elise had stood. "What just happened?" she whispered. I felt a weight lift from my chest, a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe longer. The apartment seemed brighter, warmer, as if the spell Elise had cast over it was finally broken. The girl turned toward the window, her eyes locking on mine. For the briefest moment, I thought she could see me. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, I felt myself being pulled away. I woke up in a field of light, the kind of light that doesn't hurt your eyes but wraps around you like a warm blanket. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't lost. A voice, soft, familiar, whispered in my ear. "You did it, Sophia. You're free." I don't know where I went after that, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. And Elise, she was gone for good. Or so I thought. Months later, a different girl wandered into a dusty antique shop in New York City. Tucked away in a corner was a single sheet of yellowed music, its title faint but legible, Elise's Song. The shopkeeper hesitated as she picked it up, a chill running down his spine. "You sure you want that one?" he asked. She smiled, nodding. "Yeah, it's just music, right?" When I first saw Ravenswood Manor, it was like stepping back in time. The building was all brick and iron, with gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, staring down at the street below. It wasn't shiny or modern like the new high-rises downtown, but there was something about it that drew me in. Maybe it was the history, or maybe it was the rent. It was shockingly cheap for a city like Chicago. I moved in on a gray, drizzly afternoon, the kind of day that makes everything look a little more depressing than it really is. The landlord, Mr. Carmichael, handed me the keys and gave me a quick tour. He was a gruff man, in his 60s maybe, with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He barely looked at me as he muttered something about respecting the other tenants and keeping to myself. The hallway to my apartment smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet, like overripe fruit. It wasn't awful, just odd. My unit was on the 3rd floor, near the end of the hallway. Apartment 15. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, revealing a space that was somehow both cozy and a little unsettling. High ceilings, original wood floors, and windows that let in just enough light to keep it from feeling like a cave. As I unpacked, I noticed how quiet the building was. No sound of TVs, no footsteps from above, nothing. For a building this old, I expected to hear everything. The pipes, the walls settling, the neighbors arguing, but it was dead silent, like the building itself was holding its breath. It wasn't until I was taking out the last of the boxes that I met my neighbor, Mr. Gaspard. He startled me, appearing seemingly out of nowhere as I struggled to balance a box and lock my door at the same time. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. I turned to see an older man, maybe in his 70s, with neatly combed white hair and a sweater that looked like it belonged in a catalog. He had the kind of face that instantly put you at ease, with soft wrinkles around his eyes like he smiled a lot. Sure," I said, handing him the box. "Thanks, I'm Clara, by the way." "Gaspard," he replied with a small nod. "Apartment 16, just next door. Welcome to Ravenswood. It's got its quirks, but it's a good place." He followed me down the hall, carrying the box like it weighed nothing. As we walked, he started talking about the building, how it was built in the 1920s, how it had housed everyone from jazz musicians to silent film stars back in the day. He spoke with such enthusiasm that I found myself hanging on every word. "It's got a lot of history," he said as we reached the lobby. "Some of it darker than others." I raised an eyebrow. "Dark how?" "Oh, you know," he said with a chuckle. "Old buildings always have their secrets." Before I could press him for details, he handed me the box and waved goodbye, disappearing up the staircase. I stood there for a moment, staring after him, wondering what he meant. Secrets? It was probably just small talk, but the way he said it lingered in my mind. That night, I settled into bed, exhausted but oddly restless. The rain had picked up, tapping against the windows in a rhythmic pattern that should have been soothing. Instead, it only made the silence of the building feel heavier. Around midnight, just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, I heard it. A scream. It was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. My eyes flew open, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. Another scream followed, then a low, guttural noise, like someone was crying out in pain. I bolted upright and reached for my phone, my mind racing. Was someone being attacked? Should I call 911? But before I could dial, the noise stopped. Dead silence, like it had never happened. The next morning I found myself lingering outside apartment 16, hesitating. I couldn't just knock and accuse my new neighbor of, what, watching TV too loudly? I felt ridiculous, but I needed to know. When Gaspar opened the door, he greeted me with a cheerful smile. "Good morning, Clara. Everything all right?" Yeah, I said, shifting awkwardly. "It's just, I thought I heard something last night. From your apartment. Like, screaming?" His face softened, almost apologetically. "Oh, that. I'm so sorry if it disturbed you. I was watching an old horror movie. Got a bit carried away, I'm afraid." I nodded, forcing a laugh. "No problem. I just wasn't expecting it." He chuckled. "I'll keep the volume down next time. Thanks for letting me know." As I walked away, I told myself it made sense. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about his explanation didn't add up. I couldn't stop thinking about the key. It felt cold and heavy in my pocket, like it had a presence of its own. I kept turning it over in my hand, staring at the faint 16 etched into the surface. It couldn't have been there by accident. Someone must have left it in the basement for a reason. But why? The thought of using it made me feel ridiculous. What was I going to do? Sneak into Mr. Gaspard's apartment and, what? Search for evidence of screaming? I shook the thought off. He seemed harmless, and he'd already explained it was just a movie. Still, my gut told me there was more to it. That night the noises started again. I was sitting on the couch flipping through Netflix when I heard the first sound. A thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. I muted the TV and strained to listen. It came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Then the screams began. This time, they were clearer, high-pitched, desperate, like someone begging for their life. I froze, my phone clutched in my hand, and stared at the wall separating my apartment from 16. My pulse was pounding so hard I could barely think. I knew I should call the police. I even dialed 911 before my finger hovered over the final one. What if it was just another movie? What if Gaspar had a plausible explanation again? I couldn't bear the thought of looking like a paranoid idiot. Instead, I grabbed the key. My hands were shaking as I slipped out of my apartment and into the hallway. The air was colder here, the kind of chill that sinks into your skin and makes your breath visible. I stood outside Gaspard's door, the faint screams still echoing from inside, and slid the key into the lock. It turned easily, like it was meant to be there. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space that smelled faintly of old books and something metallic. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind me. At first glance, the apartment looked normal, cozy even. The furniture was old-fashioned but well-kept. Plush armchairs, a mahogany coffee table, shelves lined with books and knickknacks. A small lamp on the side table cast a warm glow over the room, but there was something off. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. And then I noticed the silence. The screams were gone, completely. It was as if they'd never existed. I moved deeper into the apartment, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The living room led into a narrow hallway, and at the end of it, I saw a door slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out from within. "Mr. Gaspar?" I called softly, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, an invisible thread winding tighter with every step. The room at the end of the hall was different from the rest of the apartment. It was bare, almost clinical, with walls painted a sickly yellow. In the center of the room stood a large wooden chair, its surface scratched and worn. Thick leather straps hung from the armrests and legs, as if they'd been used to restrain someone. My stomach turned and I took a step back, bumping into a small table. A loud clatter broke the silence as something metal hit the floor. I bent down to pick it up. A knife. The blade was long and sharp, its edge stained with something dark. Before I could process what I was holding, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Gaspar was standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something cold and unrecognizable. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked amused. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, his voice calm, almost kind. I heard noises," I stammered, clutching the knife tightly. "I thought someone was in trouble." He took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back. "Oh, Clara, always so curious. It's dangerous, you know, letting your imagination run wild." My grip on the knife tightened as he stepped into the room. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's going on in here?" He tilted his head, his smile widening just enough to make my skin crawl. "You've already decided what you think, haven't you? You're here because you want to know the truth." He reached out, his hand grazing the edge of the chair. "But sometimes the truth isn't what we expect. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet wouldn't move. Gaspar's presence filled the room, his shadow stretching impossibly long against the wall. "You should leave now, Clara," he said, his voice low and menacing, "before you see something you can't unsee." Without another word, I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment. The door locked and bolted behind me. My hands were still shaking as I slid to the floor, the knife clattering to the ground beside me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the screams again, echoing in my head like a broken record. And when I did finally drift off, the dreams came, horrible, vivid nightmares of Gaspar standing over me, his face twisted into something monstrous. By the time morning came, I was a wreck, but something inside me had shifted. I was done being scared. I needed answers. If Gaspar thought he could frighten me into staying quiet, he was wrong. The first thing I did was grab my laptop and start digging. I searched everything I could about Ravenswood Manor, its history, old news articles, anything. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The building had a reputation. Over the years, there'd been whispers about strange disappearances, tenants who simply vanished without a trace. The common thread: all of them had lived in apartment 16. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the list of names. There were at least 10 people, all missing over the last 50 years. And each time, the landlord had the same response. They must have left without notice. No follow-ups, no investigations, just silence. It was almost noon when I heard the knock at my door. My body tensed instantly. No one ever visited me here. When I opened the door, there he was, Gaspar, standing with that same unsettling smile. "Clara," he said, his tone light and pleasant. "I thought I'd check in on you. You seemed upset last night." I forced a tight smile. "I'm fine, just tired." "Good, good," he said, stepping closer, his eyes scanning my apartment like he was looking for something. "You know, it's important to rest. A tired mind can play tricks on you." I stiffened. Was that a threat? Before I could respond, he tilted his head, his smile widening just enough to send a chill down my spine. "Well," he said, turning to leave, "you know where to find me if you need anything." I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding. I couldn't do this anymore. I had to know what was happening in that apartment. That night I waited. I sat in the dark, my ears straining for any sound. It didn't take long. Just after midnight, the noises started again. Thuds, dragging, and then the screams. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped the key into my pocket, and headed back to apartment 16. The hallway felt colder than usual, the air thick and suffocating. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the same darkened living room. But something was different. The air inside felt alive, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. "Gaspar?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped inside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was exactly as I remembered it, except for one thing. The door to the back room, the one with the chair, was wide open, and a faint light spilled out from inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to move forward. My footsteps felt heavy, like the floor was trying to hold me in place. When I reached the doorway, I froze. Gaspar was standing in the center of the room, his back to me, but he wasn't alone. Around him, shadows writhed and twisted, their shapes human but distorted. They moved in and out of the light, their faces blurred and featureless. "What are you doing here, Clara?" Gaspar's voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the shadows, their movements hypnotic and unnatural. He turned to face me, and for the first time his smile was gone. His eyes were dark, empty, like twin voids pulling me in. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, stepping closer. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "I'm what this place made me," he replied, his voice calm. "Just like it'll make you." Before I could react, the shadows surged toward me. They moved like liquid, cold and suffocating as they wrapped around my arms and legs. I struggled, gasping for air as they dragged me toward the chair. "No!" I screamed, kicking and thrashing. Gaspar watched, his expression unreadable. You wanted the truth, Clara. Now you'll be part of it. I felt the leather straps tighten around my wrists and ankles, pinning me to the chair. The room spun, the shadows closing in until they were all I could see, and then everything went still. When I opened my eyes, the shadows were gone. Gaspar stood in front of me, his face calm, almost serene. You'll understand soon enough, he said softly. I tried to move, to speak, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch as he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. Welcome to apartment 16, he whispered. When I woke up, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, almost like I was underwater. My eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, I didn't know where I was. The room was dimly lit, the sickly yellow walls casting an unnatural glow. I tried to move, but my body felt wrong, sluggish, like it wasn't entirely mine. Then I saw him, Gaspar, sitting in the corner, his hands resting on his knees, his face calm and eerily serene. "Ah, you're awake," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's always strange at first, isn't it?" I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Panic surged through me as I looked down at my hands, only they weren't my hands. They were wrinkled, pale and unfamiliar. What did you do to me?" I finally managed to croak, my voice rasping like I hadn't used it in years. Gaspard stood and walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's not what I did," he said. "It's what the apartment does. You're part of it now, Clara, just like I was." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. Every inch of me felt it, the weight of the place, the way it seemed to pulse and breathe, like it was alive, and I was now a piece of its puzzle. Gaspard knelt in front of me, his expression soft, almost pitying. "I was like you once, curious, stubborn, convinced I could figure it all out. And I did, eventually. But by then, it was too late." "You don't have to stay," I said desperately. "We can fight it, we can leave." He smiled sadly. "There is no leaving, Clara. You think I haven't tried? The apartment has its rules. It chooses who stays, who becomes part of it. And now, it's chosen you." I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to fight back, but I was frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, a loophole, something. And then I remembered the shadows, the way they dragged me, the way they seemed to be alive. Maybe they were the key. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. He straightened, his face darkening. "Now you wait, and when the next one comes, you'll understand." Before I could ask what he meant, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to ripple like water, the dim light flickering and fading. I felt a pull, a deep, gut-wrenching force dragging me backward. My vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting in an armchair in the living room of apartment 16. The space was pristine, the furniture polished and arranged perfectly, as if nothing strange had ever happened here. But something was different. I was different. I reached for my face, my hands trembling as I felt the deep lines etched into my skin. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror on the wall, a face I barely recognized. I wasn't Clara anymore. I was someone else, something else. A knock at the door startled me. My heart raced as I stood, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were learning to use my body for the first time. I opened the door to find a young woman standing there, her arms wrapped around a box, her face curious and cautious. "Hi," she said, her voice cheerful but uncertain. "I'm Alyssa. I just moved in next door." I smiled, the gesture feeling both familiar and foreign. "Welcome," I said, my voice steady, calm. "I'm Gaspar, apartment 16. As I watched her walk back to her door, I felt the apartment stir, its presence settling over me like a second skin. I understood now. I was part of it, just as Gaspar had been, just as Alyssa would be someday. The cycle was endless, unbreakable. Closing the door, I turned back to the mirror. My reflection smiled at me, its expression calm, knowing. I smiled back,